now on 2GB Sydney, 4BC Brisbane and network stations across Australia. It's time for Nights with John Stanley.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Here it is, a Monday night, beginning of a brand new week. Sometimes you need a tonic, and the whole nation got a tonic today around about lunchtime. The Olympic Games, young Ariane Titmus, who, in the great tradition of so many of our swimmers, grace, class, you get the backstory of all of the work that's been put in by her family to get her to where she got today, and the whole nation erupted. Perhaps more than it would have normally done because of everything that everyone is going through right now. Let's have more of that. We do take refuge in sport, and right now we need it at a time when New South Wales certainly has recorded another 145 new cases today. The 9th and 10th deaths related to the COVID-19 outbreak. And now, really, the question is, when are the restrictions and the lockdown going to end? And that's what people need to know. We've had a huge march on the weekend. I reacted like most people. I was angry that these thousands of people have just gone out there without masks into the streets. When you look at the signs, and so many of the people involved and so many of them who are opportunists who are involved in all of this, there has been quite a backlash. But there's no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that there's a lot of people, and I'd love to hear if you just struck me over the weekend, the quietness of the streets, and you think people who are running businesses, and you go into southwestern Sydney where the restrictions are the hardest. People who are really doing it tough, who just can't ply their trade and are finding it really difficult to continue. So if you're in that boat, you might like to let us know. 131873 is the number. There's a bit of politics around today as well, surprisingly, because I guess the politicking has to continue. Against all of that backdrop, let's welcome our Monday night guest, Peter Credlin. Peter, good evening to you.
Good to be with you, John.
Don't we need things like Ariane Titmus? Because at the moment it's very depressing, really, isn't it?
It's pretty bleak, isn't it? It's pretty bleak. And it was lovely to see someone, out there on the sporting stage at a global event and make us feel like we're all one country again. Because I tell you what, that behaviour last week by Daniel Andrews, rebuffing, and not just him, National Cabinet rebuffing Gladys Berejiklian, who was begging for help, trying to deal with Delta, which is swamping Sydney, and being knocked back. I thought, that's not who we are. That's not who we are. I'm ashamed as a Victorian, because everybody threw whatever help they could at Victoria last year, and to knock her back, I think that diminishes us all.
Yeah, we haven't spoken since last week, and we had that going on. It's been described, I think, by a few people as a state of origin-like approach by various premiers. You've had Mark McGowan throwing stones from the other side of the country, saying that New South Wales needs to lock down much harder. As you say, you've had this request from New South Wales to help in relation to southwest Sydney. This is what Gladys Berejiklian had to say about this earlier today. This is in response to Daniel Andrews. Have a listen to that.
Dan Andrews has said that if you showed him modelling which shows the lockdown is working, he'll give you some Pfizer. Are you planning to enter negotiations with Victoria on that if we're desperate for Pfizer in New South Wales?
Look, Andrew, can I say that National Cabinet made their view very, very clear to me on Friday. I argued my little heart out, but the position of the National Cabinet was very clear. I'm someone who'll always fight for New South Wales, but I'm also someone who'll work with what we have.
Yeah, and it reinforces what you were saying there, Peter, that we're all in these silos. We're not dealing with it as one country where there's a specific problem in one part of the country.
And look, if it gets out of control in Sydney, it'll be in New South Wales, it'll be down on the border, and the Murray's not going to stop it. I mean, Andrews will be dealing with it down here. And people didn't treat Victoria like lepers last year. I mean, Victoria went through, what was it today? This is our 183 or 4 days of lockdown in cumulative terms. But everyone helped Victoria last year. I just think it's a cheap shot. I think the politics, the frustration with people is, other than the New South Wales Premier, and you can have your view about Gladys, whether she should have gone earlier, harder, whatever, but there is at least an attempt to be cognizant of what these lockdowns do to small business. There's no such attempt in Victoria. 5 Everyone thinks there'll be 6 and there'll be 7 before we're out of this. They are on their knees. We look at what happened in WA and South Australia. There's just this bravado with lockdowns, and there's just this really low rent debate from what should be our leaders, and we're better than this. You know, we're up against an enemy of which we are all united. What if we were at war with another country? What if we were back in the circumstances, John, your grandparents, my grandparents were dealing with? I honestly wonder if we were really pushed with an existential threat beyond something like a virus, which is actually uniting humanity. If something was dividing humanity, dividing Australians, you know, are we as good as we once were? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, it's interesting that you raise a really interesting point in terms of we've talked here, and I know, pardon me, you've written about the National Cabinet and the way it's set up. We've learnt so much about the way our Constitution is set up and our Federation operates, and you wonder when there's another crisis, are we ready? This is why I think that you've talked about there needs to be some sort of review of how this has been dealt with, to see whether when the next crisis comes along, whatever it might be, we can do it better.
Yep, correct.
All right, 131873 is number. We had the lockdowns over the weekend. We had the protests in both Sydney and Melbourne over the weekend. I just want you to hear. This is the New South Wales Police Commissioner Mick Fuller, who's talked about this. Have a listen.
There are some discussions. There's some information on the internet at the moment about a potential protest this Saturday. Can I just put this warning out now to everyone, is that we will be heavily policed. We will be taking the ground very early. You will be arrested and protested. The community has spoken about that behaviour. The Premier has spoken about that behaviour, and it won't be tolerated again.
Yep. So, I mean, there's a lot of people who will take that as almost like an invitation, because they'll want to get out there and they'll want to clash with the police, and they've got their signs and they think it's all a conspiracy. How are they going to be stopped?
I think it's really difficult because this is a grassroots movement. This isn't like last year where they were quite coordinated, the anti-lockdown protests. I mean, Black Lives Matter was very coordinated. And I'm at least not a hypocrite in my view. I'm against these lockdown protests this year just as hard as I was against the Black Lives Matter protests. I think I have great sympathy for them, and I'm not going to denigrate them and call them names as others have done, because I understand some of them are the renter crowd, sure, but some of them are desperate small businesses who don't feel like they've got a voice or being heard, and they're basically on the bones of their backside. They literally are up against it all. So I'm mindful of how tough things are for them, but it just gives, you know, in the case of Daniel Andrews in Victoria, a reason to keep screwing things down. Now, we thought we might be out of this lockdown tomorrow. There's word on the Herald Sun website tonight that it might go for another 3 or 4 days. Last year we suffered 16 weeks, and it was 2 weeks at a time. Now, no one's got great confidence in how we're going to manage this exit protest, how long we're actually going to be out of lockdown, and what the ongoing restrictions look like. A lot of businesses are in the media tonight saying that they can't even open. They can't imagine opening with any restrictions. They're probably better to keep the doors closed. So you've got all of that going on, and protests like we saw on the weekend play into their hands, right? They give bad premiers excuses to keep us locked up, and we're all angry. We just want to get out of this as quickly as possible, and I think that was the worry, that last weekend made things worse, not better. Yeah,
I mean, I speak to, you know, just the way I move around, 1 or 2 businesses that I've seen progressively over the last couple of weeks, and these are people who are operating like as a takeaway only. In another case where they can't sell anything, they've got restrictions on what they can do, and I see them regularly, and you can just see each day the morale's just dropping, and they're now thinking that it could go, you know, into the middle of September. So you're thinking, well, how am I going to keep going? How am I going to
how can you
continue?
They can't. You know, they've got rent to pay on their shop. They've got all the usual outgoings. There's no great relief for them this year, unlike last year. And, of course, if they've got a home, it's either rent or a mortgage. They've got kids and school uniforms and shoes and all the things that mums and dads have to pay for. And a lot of I grew up in a small business family, John. Most of them have got their homes and mortgaged to the hilt. to take a punt on themselves
that's right.
and be self-employed.
Yep. Yeah, well, I've got to say, and you say that, no, I've never run a business, and that's why I always, pontificating here when I've got a job. But I've spoken to people, and I know people who've started businesses, and quite often they'll say, "I've borrowed everything, and we need to work. We need to succeed in the first month, or we go under." And you see it happen. That's how tight it is, and they believe in themselves and they back themselves, and it works. And you want to give them a big pat on the back and a hug sometimes, because you think you've taken a punt. And it's worked. Could you imagine someone who did that, and then a month after it started, everything's going well, business going well, suddenly have to shut down? How devastating would that be?
Yeah.
Can't even think about
tough.
it. Just dreadful. Look, there's a bit of politics around today, which I want to get your thoughts on, but I want to take some calls just in relation to Paul. Paul's on the northern beaches of Sydney, where, now, Paul, you're in lockdown. You're in the northern beaches, right, in Sydney, is that right?
That's right, John. And I was just thinking if I just make firstly, a good evening, John and Peter. Love your program. Just wondering if I could make a comment, then ask you a question. It's obvious that listening to Gladys's Coconut Telegraph, we're going to get some lifting of lockdown, perhaps on the northern beaches. So here's a suggestion based on your comment about takeaway and meeting your friend each day, whatever that may be. People have social needs. They need to connect. Often we're social animals. This can be done around coffee or takeaway food, etc. And the businesses need to be up and running. What about in these limited lockdown areas? We have open, like cafes outside, restaurants outside, clubs outside, where people can have social distancing, still connect, businesses can operate, and we have a sort of a beginning of the lifting of lockdown. What do you think of that?
Well, it sounds, look, it makes sense because well, it's cold at the moment, but there's no problem because in the sunshine during the day, outside there's not there's not there's evidence that it's being passed on in that circumstance. But you're talking about social distancing, Peter. What do you think? Is it the sort of creative thing you could actually do in one area?
Look, I think you can, provided people take it in the spirit to which it's intended. I mean, again, if we were all doing the right thing from the get-go, if people were not feeling great and they went and got tested, or they stayed at home and did their full 14 days like they're meant to, if they're a questionable case, we perhaps would have got this under control a little bit earlier. That certainly would have been our experience last year in Melbourne. Now, I think having been punished so hard last year, these lockdowns this year, number 3, number 4, number 5, I think have been dealt better by Victorians. I'm not so sure, looking from afar, that Sydney took it seriously. It didn't look like that, certainly on the news at night. At the start of the lockdown, I think absolutely people are taking it seriously now. Yeah. And if you were in the position where people could socially distanced, see a friend, particularly those who live alone, particularly older Australians, when they're walking their dog in a park or getting a coffee, and that they could be distant, but at least have someone that they know and love give them, half an hour of company, I think that's sensible. But are people going to then run up to each other and give them a hug and break all the rules and just create more clusters? I don't know.
Yeah. Is there a sense, and again, I'll ask you, thank you for your call, Paul, because everyone's ideas, and sometimes that's why I love Monday nights, Peter, because you know how process works, and it's easy for us to talk about things, but you know how governments work, and sometimes you know that there are things you'd like to do that just can't be done because of the way it works, and that can be frustrating. Or they've
been tried and they've failed, and that's just been learned history.
Yeah, that's right. But now they're talking about mass vaccinations of supermarket workers, of people who are working in supermarkets, because supermarkets do have to keep operating. There's no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. And I remember, but I remember when this began more than a year ago, thinking about the poor people who are working in the supermarkets who are being exposed every day and wearing their masks. I'm thinking, are we only thinking about that right now? I'm just thinking, hasn't it been obvious?
And you're right, John. It was talked about last year. I think what's focused people's minds is the very sorry circumstance, I think, with the Sydney outbreak, is how many young people are hospitalised and in intensive care, and in some cases on ventilators. A very sorry circumstance of a woman in her 30s who passed away on the weekend. No known comorbidities, no previous history. I think that's got us thinking about all the people that stack the shelves and stand at the cash register and all of those jobs that we just take for granted, right? You know, we might be at home working on our laptop, but the only way they earn money is to be out there. And I mean, I felt a bit vulnerable last year when everyone else was locked up. We didn't have vaccines on the horizon then. And I was out every single day going to work because the only way I could do my show was going into a studio. It meant I couldn't see Mum for 4.5 months, and because she's older and vulnerable. So I tried not to let it get to me, but there were a couple of times, I have to say, a couple of days that I thought, this is really rough. Why am I out there in order to earn a quid when all these other people can work from home? So I think this is a move by the Shoppers Union that got through today, and I think it's a good move. Yeah,
because they have been on the front line, and it's been, they have just paraded people there every single day. And as you know, in the early stages, they were the ones copping abuse because there was no toilet paper.
Correct.
Nothing to do with them.
We should never be in a country where we allow casual or lower skilled workers to be treated as cannon fodder, or to be someone sort of I was going to say a word, but you can't say that anymore. Just treated like they're just a commodity. I think that's wrong. Yeah.
Look, Grant says here a small business owner in the ski resorts, one of the ski areas, opened his cafe 5 weeks ago. No skiers because the lockdown had to close, not eligible for government assistance. Would have been a really good ski season this year, wouldn't it? I think there's been pretty good snow.
Looks like a cracker. Yeah, they've had some very good snow. Why is he not eligible for government assistance?
I don't know. It says here, I don't know what that would be. Maybe, I don't know, it was only open 5 weeks. Give us a bit more detail on that, Grant, because
there seems to be a lot of businesses falling through the cracks. I think that's the great concern. Yes, there's money going to individuals. This is the disaster payment money, and it's about on par with what the JobKeeper payment was to individuals. But from what I can sense, certainly in Victoria, in businesses I've had on my show, is bugger all money going to actual small businesses. I think that's a real...
Yeah. If you're in that situation, you might like to give us a call. Let us know. 131873 is the number. Look, I want to get onto this in a moment. We might mention it now. The decision today, and I'll get your thoughts as well, and we'll keep taking calls on COVID, but I just want to introduce a couple of other things and get your thoughts on this. The Labor Party, they did flag this earlier in the year, Peter, but they've got rid of their negative gearing policy, and they've backed the third stage of tax cuts. Just this is a bit of Anthony Albanese explaining what he's doing today. Have a listen.
As Labor leader, I am absolutely determined to look to the future, not relitigate the past.
Yeah, so they've dumped that policy, both policies, the policy to oppose the third stage of tax cuts and their changes to negative gearing, which had been flagged. And you've had Jim Chalmers, who's the Shadow Treasurer. He was saying earlier in the year that they were opposed to the third stage of the tax cuts. So that's what he had to say today.
So what it means is for the 9 million plus Australians who earn $45,000 or more, they'll get the same tax cut under the Morrison government as under us. And there's certainty when it comes to the existing negative gearing and capital gains tax arrangements as well.
Has this got a smell about it, Peter, of going back to 2007? You'd remember this well, where they're basically saying, well, look, there'll be no policy changes under us. You can, when we had John Howard light business with Kevin Rudd, what do you think? Or is that what they're trying to do?
What do you say? Economic conservative, remember? I'm Kevin, I'm from Queensland, I'm here to help, and I'm an economic conservative. Yeah, absolutely. This is the quintessential sort of small target strategy. Now, they're not ruling it out. They're not ruling it out anywhere. I don't buy it for a minute. It's been a core belief, negative gearing, for such a long time with Labor. They've taken it to 2 elections. They didn't drop it, a year ago. They're dropping it just this side of an election. I wouldn't rule out that they'll do it anyway at some point in time. We've seen there's been a pattern of all of that. We saw Julia Gillard, no carbon tax in the government I lead, Yep. As soon as she could, she put it in there. So, but what they're trying to do is John Howard used to say, get rid of the barnacles, neutralise the negatives going into the campaign. And in terms of politicking and campaigning, it's a smart move.
Yeah, all right. Siv wanted to talk about that. He's on the line, one of our regulars. Hello, Siv.
G'day there, John and Peter. Well, listening to that, I think I accord with a lot of that view. I mean, I can't see the Labor guys get, and The question I'd ask, well, if you're dumping that, what do you actually believe in then? Because you guys fought tooth and nail for those policies, and you jumped at anybody who was critical of you of your position. You know, so I mean, you're dumping it now. I'm with you there, Peter, about all that. There's a whiff of politics about it. As a campaigning, it's probably smart because people can't bring it up and go, "What about that policy?" But I think they're banking on the fact that most people have short memories.
Yep. All right.
I think that's what it is.
Yeah, true.
With negative gearing
I think
too.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, look, I mean, negative gearing. I mean, with interest rates so low, it's not that attractive at the moment either. Negative gearing with interest rates at the point. If you're ever going to change negative gearing, you'd probably be arguing to do it now when there isn't. It can't still be happening at a huge rate in terms of new arrangements because rates are so low. But plainly, it's off the table now. So the question is going to be asked: well, what is the difference apart from you're not Scott Morrison? Maybe that's what's going to be. Maybe that's going to be.
It's off the table now for now. But
Yep.
I mean, the architects, Chris Bowen, for example, still on the front bench. Now, what if Albanese is elected as Prime Minister on the other side of an election? He ends up in an economic portfolio at some time. He was profoundly committed to this policy. So I don't think it's gone. I think it's just gone for now. It's gone this side of an election. And, people just need to have that at the back of their mind when they make up a decision about who they're going to vote for and what it'll do to their immediate circumstances. I mean, we know most of the people that have a negatively geared home have won, and they're nurses and, teachers and
that's right.
Cops and, I mean, just relatively ordinary income earners.
Yeah, most people just have one. And look, over the weekend we had Brad Norrington, who writes for the Australian newspaper. He's an experienced reporter who's got very good connections in the industrial movement, and he wrote a big feature saying that a number of people had reported that Bill Shorten had told them he's going to come back. He's still entertaining the thought of coming back, maybe after a couple of leadership changes. Do you buy that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I've spent my time observing people that were once in leadership roles on both sides of politics that then get pushed out to the fringe, and there's a phase of rehabilitation, reaching out to colleagues, fighting their way back, making points of difference just to keep sort of, their constituencies alive. It's interesting. Bill Shorten was quite critical of Daniel Andrews for not stepping up and helping out New South Wales. That was a point of difference he didn't need to make between him and Andrews. He didn't need to make it between him and Albanese. But he's not stupid. There'll be people in New South Wales tonight cranky at the Victorians for not doing what they can to help them out in a bind when they helped them last year, and he's smart enough to realise that. Yep.
131873 is the number. We've got Peter Credlin here on this Monday night. Your chance to have your say. We'll take some more calls if you're waiting on. We'll get to you in a moment. We've got text messages and emails as well. It's 8:30 on this Monday. 131873 is our number. 27 minutes to 9. Peter Credlin's with us on this Monday. Look, I haven't seen this ABC show, which is focusing on female women in politics. I've noticed a lot of criticism of it, saying it's unbalanced. Have you seen any of it, Peter? Or,
just snippets of it.
And it does seem like some of the people that could have been contributing haven't been asked. Would that be a fair assessment? Would you?
Well, I think there has been. I mean, I certainly was asked to be on it, but I'm not stupid, right? So I've got a contract with Sky, but even if they would let me go on it, I was never going to get a fair go with the ABC. And it looks to me, particularly the way it's framed, Mr. Howard, and Tony Abbott and others, I think it had an agenda from the get-go, and which is disappointing. There's certainly a lot more women from the left, Greens, Labor, Democrats and others interviewed. Very few Liberal women, very few women from the National Party. I mean, there's National Party women in Cabinet. I think that's disappointing. That's disappointing. Yeah. And again, getting up this misogyny line about Tony Abbott and things, I just reject that. Look, people have had a good look at me now for 5 years in the media. Do you think someone who stacks up as a misogynist would hire me in the most senior role you can have for a staffer in Canberra? I'm no wallflower, and so he clearly is big enough to be able to put a woman in that role and cop a woman who has an opinion and is going to speak her mind, rightly or wrongly. Now, I think that's to his credit.
Yep.
I think that's to his credit.
There's a maternity leave scheme as well, which I'm sure might have been an issue within your own office.
Long before me, hey?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, long before me.
Yeah. Let me I'll ask you one other thing though. There was a vignette they showed of it, which had women from all sides of politics, where they all seemed to share a similar experience. I'm just wondering where they all talked about being in a room full of men. They'd come up with an idea and then they'd go around the room and someone else had come up with the idea and a male would appropriate their idea, and they all seem to have the same. Have you noticed that over the years where men appropriate women's ideas and just move on with them?
Yeah.
There you go. Easy.
I have to say,
Easy.
I do have to say I agree with that.
Easy.
But I've also seen, people with the biggest voices. I've seen men appropriate men's ideas as well.
I've seen that too. Yep.
I think there are some men who are just quieter personalities, big brains who've done the homework. They get run over the top by the showman in politics, and the showman pilfers everybody else's ideas and sells them as their own. So I don't think it's just necessarily confined to women.
Yeah, there's a lot of that goes on. Yeah, 131873. Can we go to Carla's in Lake Macquarie? Hello, Carla.
Hello. Well, I actually have a business in Sydney, and I put in the application last week, and I just want to tell you the answer to your question earlier is that you have to have a business for at least 2 years, because it compares 2 years ago at the same period when the actual lockdown started.
Right.
That's the first point. The second point is if you're 30% down, you get $5,000. If you're 50% down, you get $7,000. And if you're 70% down, you get $15,000. So it's not a huge amount, depending on, and that could be for any business, depending on, rent and so forth. Yeah, but the other thing is businesses don't feel like everyone's in it together, because the minimum, which is 30% down, if you've got all the politicians and all the bureaucrats to have a 30% pay cut, the lockdown would end tomorrow. And everyone knows that, and business people do not feel as if we're all in it together. They just don't. And so another thing is the daily cases. Why don't they have the daily suicides? Why don't they have the daily numbers of businesses that have gone out of business? Why don't they have the daily number of foreclosures on houses? And then we go, 2 people dead, 8 people dead, 20 people suicided. Oh, geez. You know what I mean? Like, there's no proportionality. We're being led by the nose, by the health bureaucrats. There is no... You should have a mental health person, the health person, the people how many mortgages have been defaulted on, how many businesses have gone down. This is what real life is.
Yep. Well, Carla, look, thank you for the call. And Peter, I guess you'd be hearing messages like that all the time. Talking to business people.
Oh, but did you see those? Yeah, and those statistics from Kids Helpline last week. Horrific increases in attempted suicides by young people as young as primary school age children, calling Kids Helpline threatening to take their own life, and ambulances having to be called to homes. Those statistics were horrific. They were just Victorian. I have no doubt the same thing's happening interstate as well. I think the problem for business is the big businesses will restructure and look after themselves. A lot of them have already stood down staff. Those staff are not getting any income whatsoever. Hopefully they're on disaster payments. But small business, if the hurdle is too hard to qualify, and listening to your caller there, it sounds like there's quite a lot of detail to it, then they'll have nothing coming through. So not only have they got nothing to pay their staff, they might have a couple of staff or pay their rent, etc. They've got nothing to pay their mortgage or put food on the table or petrol in the car, all the other things that a small business does out of the money it earns from its business before it even pays themselves. Most people in small business don't get a wage. They basically scrape together what's there in terms of profit at the end of the month, if they are in profit, and they pay their own household outgoings. They're not rich. They only really make money, John, when they sell their business at the end of the time that they've had it. I think we're going to have really significant economic shock coming out of this that will live with us for a long time.
Yep. All right, 131873. We'll get back to your calls in a moment, and I've got a text message I want to share with you as well. Before we do that, though, here we go.
An update from Japan, thanks to the new Kia Cerato GT. Get mean.
From our Olympic studio, Jordan Tunbridge has got the news for us. Jordan, good evening.
Good evening to you, John. Let's start with a bit of swimming. Ariarne Titmus has advanced to the semi-finals of the 200 freestyle just hours after winning gold in the 400 free. So an incredible effort to back up her gold medal performance earlier on. So the 20-year-old, she came first in Heat 4, while her American rival Katie Ledecky took out Heat 2. Australian Maddie Wilson came third in that heat. So Wilson was actually 0.01 of a second faster than Titmus, but look, all Titmus needed to do was make it through. The top 16 in the heats got through.
All right, okay, that's that, and some rugby and some tennis news as well.
Yes, well, Australia has defeated Korea 42-5 in its second Rugby Sevens pool clash in Tokyo. Lockie Miller scoring 2 tries as the Aussies made up for their very disappointing loss earlier in the day to Argentina. And in tennis, Ash Barty and Storm Sanders have won their second round doubles clash against China, but losses a few in the singles earlier. John Millman, Max Purcell and Isla Tomljanovic all eliminated. John?
Okay, good on you, Jordan. We'll keep in touch, of course, as the night goes through. Any other news? At 19 minutes to 9, one other bit of sporting news. Minjee Lee, she's the older sister of Min Woo Lee from Perth, who won the Scottish Open a couple of weeks ago in golf. She's won the big Evian Masters major in Europe this morning. Huge win for her, and what a brother and sister pair they are from Perth, Australia. Min Woo Lee and Minjee Lee. 18 minutes to 9 now. We are focusing, of course, very much on what's been happening in Greater Sydney and New South Wales. Queensland's a different situation, of course, and Victoria, every state, we know every state's different. We've learnt that certainly over the last 18 months. But in New South Wales and Greater Sydney at the moment, of course, you can't leave your home. You can actually go out and exercise with one person within 10 kilometres of your house, but you can't meet up with someone. You can't go and sit in the park with someone. You have to be walking. Now, this is this whole business of being able to have a single bubble where people who live on their own can have companionship. I've got a text, I won't give the name of the person, but they say their husband attempted suicide at the beginning of COVID. Thankfully, unsuccessfully. A month ago, he moved out, severed the relationship. Part of his exit frustration was he thought I was paranoid, asking him to wear a mask in his large office. Anyway, this person, the bottom line is, the effect of COVID there, I was beside myself with grief, loneliness and isolation. And please rally for those alone to nominate a person to visit. So you could nominate a person. This is what happened in Victoria, wasn't it, eventually, Peter, where you could nominate a person that could visit you?
Yeah, you could nominate someone to be in your single bubble and you could visit them, they could visit you. My mum was in that spot 4.5 months without having anyone over. I think it's incredibly tough, and particularly it's tough for people living on their own that are older Australians who are used to their grandkids coming around. Of course, grandchildren could be carriers of COVID and not display any symptoms, and obviously not in the vaccination cohort right now. You've worked all your life. You're looking forward to whatever years you've got left to spend time with your friends in retirement, see your family, do a little bit of local travel. All of that's constrained and stolen from them. So I don't know why when you're 31 days or whatever it is into the lockdown in Sydney, why it's taken so long. But, that's got to be front of mind. I think COVID policy to deal with COVID is almost worse than COVID itself. The way in which we are losing our humanity, we've got states fighting against states, we're not pulling together as a country, the $1 trillion debt, the mental health consequences, the lack of education for our kids, not just the mental health aspects, but just lack of scholastic advancement, all of these things, and also too, all the other things that are on government's plate, John, that just aren't getting looked at. I had someone on my show tonight talking about the cladding issue in New South Wales. Now, 4 years ago, we had Grenfell, millions of dollars put on the table to fix the problem in New South Wales. It's still not fixed. Still not fixed. So while we're all focused on this pandemic, what else is happening that should be happening or not happening that should be happening?
It's a very good point. Brad's called us from Cairns in Queensland. Hello, Brad.
G'day, John and Peter.
G'day.
I know this is a totally different thing, and we didn't have lockdown in 87. We had the financial crash. But the government, I think we've got to realise the government has been very generous with our taxpayer money. They've helped our pensioners. They've helped our JobKeeper. Businesses like Harvey Norman and Bunnings have thrived on it. And back in 87, when the Labor government was in with Hawke and Keating, we didn't get a red razor.
This is when the stock market crashed,
People went to the wall then, and that was late at the recession that Paul Keating said the recession we had to have, and that went into the mid-90s.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, Brad, but the thing here, Peter, some of those large businesses have benefited from JobKeeper and the like, but then there's smaller businesses, as you've been saying, that go through the cracks and that don't get any assistance.
Well, yeah, and also government is shutting them down. So I
right.
come from the principle where if government shuts you down through no fault of your own, then as taxpayers we expect government's got to look after people.
Yep. 131873 is the number now. We'll take a break. We'll come back, wind up. We've got Peter Credlin here. It's a Monday night right across the country at 11 minutes to 9. Just a text message here. Do we have updates about COVID numbers in regional areas? I think we know that Orange, that central western part of New South Wales, has been in lockdown for... They went into a 1 week lockdown there. There's been no cases, as I understand it, there since then. But Ballina, there was a fellow flew from Sydney to Ballina on the 14th of July. But they've been doing a lot of testing and they haven't had any other cases since then. So I think the regional areas are still remaining relatively free. Peter Credlin with us for a couple more minutes. I'm going to go to Robert. Robert, hello.
Hi, John. Hi, Peter. Look, the Labor Party announced quite a number of revenue-raising initiatives today. They didn't tell us how they can replace all that income.
Well,
that's a very good point.
Yep.
It's a very good point. But I suspect they're thinking, goodness me, if the coalition's delivered trillions of dollars in terms of debt, they might fly under the radar at this election, unlike in previous elections.
Yeah, that's right.
They'll have to, when there's a thing called PFO that comes out when you get into the election proper. It's a economic statement, a bit like a mini budget, a bit like the one you see at the end of the year called MyEFO, which is the mid-year economic update. That's put out in an election context, and you get to sort of look at the costings of various policies, look at the balance sheet, broadly speaking, of both major parties as they go into the election. So we will have a look at it before we all go to vote, but it's never as comprehensive as you might find in a budget.
All right. Thank you, Robert. 131873. We've got a minute or two. David, you wanted to just talk about what sort of assistance there is for small business?
Yeah. So my wife is basically applying for the micro business loan, and our accountant basically said that you don't qualify because in the first week of the lockdown, she got a payment of $500 for the disaster payment. But the microbusiness loan wasn't really announced until 3 weeks after that payment. And so there's lots of little fine print that's happening this time around, and it's making me sort of concerned that the government isn't really fully being open and on board about helping people out during this lockdown as they have previously.
Is it a business where essentially because of what's happened, the business has been hobbled?
Oh, she's in the wedding industry, so it's been completely decimated.
Completely, yeah.
Completely. And we're in Bondi, so we got locked down before anyone else, and applied for the $500, got it, and then now finds that the microbusiness strategy only applies if you didn't apply for anything previously.
Okay, all right. Can we
just
get some?
Find out if
we might look into that if we can. We might just look into that if we can, and we'll pass it on to the other programs because, Peter, these things, I suppose, you know how it works with. They're doing this stuff on the run, and so situations like that where you got a wedding business and suddenly it's been because of the government shut down. You can't operate. What do you do?
Yeah, I've got to ask questions of the Treasurer's Office tomorrow because on the face of it, it looks like the quantum, like the money under this current disaster payment to an individual, $600 a week, and we know that JobKeeper in the last iteration was around $1,200 a fortnight. So on the face of it, the money looks like it's the same.
Yep.
But why does everyone want JobKeeper, and why is everyone broadly unhappy with this disaster payment? So it must be the qualifying rules.
Yep.
It must be, I think, the perhaps one was better towards business. If the individuals are paid the same, one must have had a better slant towards business.
Right.
So I'm not sure of that. I'll find out and I can report back.
On your show tomorrow night, we'll do the same, and we'll talk to you again next week, Peter. Thank you so much once again.